The Universal Christ by Richard Rohr. Chapter 6. A Sacred Wholeness. Truly, my life is one long hearkening unto myself and unto others and unto God. Etty Hillesum, An Interrupted Life. Etty Hillesum, a young Jewish woman who was killed at Auschwitz in 1943, provides all of us with an important example of a non-Christian witness to the universal Christ mystery. Before being imprisoned by the Nazis, Etty had been quite a modern woman, as unafraid of life, of her sexuality, and other sensual pleasures, as she was, as finally was of death. Yet, although she wasn't a Christian, she was highly spiritual in the best sense of that term. She was an utter realist, devoid of self-pity, and with an almost impossible freedom from need to blame, hate, or project her inner anxiety elsewhere. Without desiring to patronize her, I would identify Etty as a person Karl Rahner would have called an anonymous Christian, someone who unravels the underlying mystery of incarnation better than most Christians I know. Such folks are much more common than Christians imagine, although they do not need that appellation. As the Nazi began their campaign of genocide and Etty's future became more and more uncertain, she addressed God repeatedly in her diaries, regarding him not as an external savior, but as a power she could nurture and feed inside of her. She honored and loved this very power in his seeming powerlessness, which is the precise meaning of the crucified Jesus. Just notice the power of these words to God. Alas, there doesn't seem to be much you, yourself, can do about our circumstances, about our lives. Neither do I hold you responsible. You cannot help us, but we must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last. In another place, a letter to a close friend from the Westerbork transit camp, not long before she was sent to Auschwitz, she writes from that foundational place of faith, hope, and love that I wrote about in the last chapter. In spite of everything, you always end up with the same conviction. Life is good after all. It's not God's fault that things go awry sometimes. The cause lies in ourselves, and that's what stays with me even now, even when I'm about to be packed off to Poland with my whole family. Yet in another place, she incomprehensibly writes as if she is a different species of human being. Those 2 months behind barbed wire have been the 2 richest and most intense months of my life, in which my highest values were so deeply confirmed. I have learnt to love Westerbork. Reflections like these, especially considering the circumstances, make Etty a profound expression for us of complete wholeness, or what St. Bonaventure called the coincidence of opposites. How does anyone achieve such a holding together of opposites? Things like inner acceptance and outer resistance, intense suffering and perfect freedom, my little self and an infinite God, sensuality and intense spirituality, the need to blame somebody and the freedom to blame nobody. Etty Hillesum demonstrated this ability like few people I have ever studied. Either such people are the cutting edge of human consciousness and civilization, or they are mentally deranged. They surely far transcend any formal religion. Nihilism is but one example of another function of the Christ, a universally available voice that calls all things to become whole and true to themselves. God's two main tools in this direction, from every appearance, seem to be great love and great suffering. And often great love that invariably leads to great suffering. The supreme irony of life is that this voice of Christ works through and alongside of what always seems like unwholeness and untruth. Yet God insists on incorporating the seeming negative. There is no doubt that God allows suffering. In fact, God seems to send us on the path toward our own wholeness, not by eliminating the obstacles, but by making use of them. Most of the novels, operas, and poems ever written seem to have the same message in one way or another. Yet it still comes as a shock and a disappointment when we experience it in our own little lives. But apart from love and suffering, both of which are always undeserved, I see no other way that humans would recalibrate, reset, or change course. Why would we? The whole-making instinct. Carl Jung, 1875 to 1961, the famous Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, was highly critical of his Christian heritage because he did not find much transformation, what he called whole-making, in the Christians he knew. Instead, he saw a religious tradition that had become externally focused, moralistic, and ineffective in actually changing people or cultures. His own father and 5 uncles were Swiss Reformed ministers, and Jung found them to be unhappy and unhealthy men. I'm not sure what his exact evidence was for this perception, but clearly it was disillusioning to Jung. He did not want to end up like the religious men in his life. Yet Jung was neither an atheist nor anti-Christian. He insisted that each of us has an inner God archetype, or what he termed the whole-making instinct. The God archetype is the part of you that drives you toward greater inclusivity by deep acceptance of the real, the balancing of opposites, simple compassion toward the self, and the ability to recognize and forgive your own shadow side. For Jung, wholeness was not to be confused with any kind of supposed moral perfection, because such moralism is too tied up with ego and denial of the inner weakness that all of us must accept. I deeply agree with him. In his critique of his father and uncles, Jung recognized that many humans had become reflections of the punitive God they worshipped. A forgiving God allows us to recognize the good in the supposed bad, and the bad in the supposed perfect or ideal. Any view of God as tyrannical or punitive tragically keeps us from admitting these seeming contradictions. It keeps us in denial about our true selves and forces us to live on the surface of our own lives. If God is a shaming figure, then most of us naturally learn to deny, deflect, or pass on that shame to others. If God is torturer in chief, then a punitive and moralistic society is validated all the way down. We are back into problem-solving religion instead of healing and transformation. Wholeness for Jung was about harmony and balancing, a holding operation more than an expelling operation. But he recognized that such consciousness was costly because humans prefer to deal with the tensions of life by various forms of denial, moralizing, addiction, or projection, By the 1930s, Jung said there was so much repressed, denied, and projected shadow material in Europe, the supposedly Christian continent, that another great war was almost inevitable. Tragically, his prediction ended up being fully correct. I do not think Jung would have been exposed to my distinction between Jesus and Christ. More likely, he would have used the two words interchangeably, as have most people up to now. But if I read him correctly, his God archetype can teach us something important about the Christian and the Christ mystery and our participation in it. He understood that the full journey toward wholeness must always include the negative experiences, the cross, that we usually reject. In that, Jung was more Christian than the critics who called him anti-Christian. The voice that is great within us. To follow their own paths to wholeness, both Eddie Hillesum and Carl Jung trusted in and hearkened to the voice of God in their deepest selves. Many educated and sophisticated people are not willing to submit to indirect, subversive, and intuitive knowing, which is probably why they rely too much, far too much, on external law and ritual behavior to achieve their spiritual purposes. They know nothing else that feels objective and solid. Intuitive truth, that inner whole-making instinct, just feels too much like our own thoughts and feelings. And most of us are not willing to call this God, even when that voice prompts us toward compassion instead of hatred, forgiveness instead of resentment, generosity instead of stinginess, bigness instead of pettiness. But think about it. If the incarnation is true, then of course, God speaks to you through your own thoughts. Joan of Arc is frequently credited with this brilliant reply when the judge accused her of being the victim of her own imagination. How else would God speak to me? Many of us have been trained to write off these inner voices as mere emotion, religious conditioning, or psychological manipulation. Perhaps they sometimes are, but often they are not. God talk seems beneath the dignity of the modern and postmodern person. Ironically, this is half right. The inner voice, so honored by Hillesum and Jung, is experienced as the deepest and usually hidden self, where most of us do not go. It truly does not speak at a level beneath rational consciousness. It truly does speak at a level beneath rational consciousness, a place where only the humble or the trained know how to go. At one point, Jung wrote, "My pilgrim's progress has been to climb down 1,000 ladders until I could finally reach out a hand of friendship to the little clod of earth that I am." Jung, a supposed unbeliever, knew that any authentic God experience takes a lot of humility and a lot of honesty. The proud cannot know God because God is not proud, but infinitely humble. Remember, only like can know like. A combination of humility and patient seeking is the best spiritual practice of all. And this is where embracing the Christ mystery becomes utterly practical. Without the meditation of Christ, we will be tempted to overplay the distance and the distinction between God and humanity. But because of the incarnation, the supernatural is forever embedded in the natural, making the very distinction false. How good is that? This is why saints like Augustine and Teresa of Avila, and thinkers like Carl Jung, seem to fully equate the discovery of their own souls with the very discovery of God. It takes much of our life, much lived experience, to trust and allow such a process. But when it comes, it will feel like a calm and humble ability to quietly trust yourself and trust God at the same time. Isn't that what we all want? If you can trust and listen to this inner divine image, this whole-making instinct, or what I called in an earlier book, your true self, you will be moving forward with your best, your largest, your kindest, your most inclusive self. I should also add, your most compassionately dissatisfied self, because the soul's journey invites us to infinite depth that we can never fully plumb. As Augustine says, a temporal thing is loved before we have it, and it grows worthless when we gain it, for it does not satisfy the soul. But the eternal is more ardently loved the more it is acquired. The soul will find the eternal even more valuable after once tasting it. I'm quite sure that this is what drove Etty Hillesum ever deeper and ever forward, and allowed her to follow a very sensual, even sexual experience in the bedroom with prayers of adoration on the bathroom floor, all within the same half hour. Spiritual satisfactions feed on themselves, grow by themselves, create wholeness, and are finally their own reward. Material satisfactions, while surely not bad, have a tendency to become addictive, because instead of making you whole, they repeatedly remind you of how incomplete, needy, and empty you are. As alcoholics often say, your addiction makes you need more and more of what is not working. Spiritual satisfactions will often be communicated to us in material, embodied, and ecstatic forms. However, embodiment is good and necessary, so don't dismiss it too quickly as the flesh. The difference is in how we encounter these forms. If we can be satisfied to enjoy them, observe them, participate in them, they give us ongoing joy. They are fingers pointing at the moon. But once we try to possess, capture, or own the moon, or any material thing, pulling it inside our own ego control, it is somehow polluted. Social scientists say that the excitement that surrounds the opening of a physical gift fades within a very few minutes. In fact, far from consuming spiritual gifts for yourself alone, you must receive all words of God tenderly and subtly, so that you can speak them to others tenderly and with subtlety. I would even say that anything said with too much bravado, over-assurance, or with any need to control or impress another is never the voice of God within you. I hope I am not doing that here. If any thought feels too harsh, shaming, or diminishing of yourself or others, it is not likely the voice of God. Trust me on that. That is simply your voice. Why do humans so often presume the exact opposite? That shaming voices are always from God, and grace voices are always the imagination. That is a self-defeating, demonic path. Yet as a confessor and a spiritual director, I can confirm that this broken logic is the general norm. If something comes toward you with grace and can pass through you and toward others with grace, you can trust it as the voice of God. If something comes toward you with grace and can pass through you and toward others with grace, You can trust it as the voice of God. Try doing this for yourself, maybe even out loud. It only comes with practice. One holy man who came to visit me recently put it this way: we must listen to what is supporting us. We must listen to what is encouraging us. We must listen to what is urging us. We must listen to what is alive in us. I personally was so trained not to trust those voices that I think I often did not hear the voice of God speaking to me, or what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. Yes, a narcissistic person can and will misuse such advice, but a genuine God lover will flourish inside such a dialogue. That is the risk that God takes, and we must take, for the sake of a fruitful love relationship with God. It takes so much courage and humility to trust the voice of God within. Mary fully personifies such trust in her momentous and free "Let it be" to the Archangel Gabriel, Luke chapter 1, verse 38. And she was an uneducated teenage Jewish girl. Most Christians have been taught to hate or confess our sin before we've ever recognized its true shape. But if you nurture hatred towards yourself, it won't be long before it shows itself as hatred toward others. This is garden variety Christianity, I am afraid. But it comes at a huge cost to history. Unless religion leads us on a path to both depth and honesty, much religion is actually quite dangerous to the soul and to society. In fact, fast food religion and the so-called prosperity gospel are some of the very best ways to actually avoid God while talking about religion almost nonstop. We must learn how to recognize the positive flow and to distinguish it from the negative resistance within ourselves. It takes years, I think. If a voice comes from accusation and leads to accusation, it is quite simply the voice of the accuser, which is the literal meaning of the biblical word Satan. Shaming, accusing, or blaming is simply not how God talks. It is how we talk. God is supremely nonviolent, and I have learned that from the saints and mystics that I have read and met and heard about, that many holy people cannot be wrong.